both individually and collectively.
Both individually and collectively.
Debt renders impossible
Debt renders impossible
many of our political aspirations.
many of our political aspirations.
In this
country,
debt historically has been promoted
debt historically has been promoted
as a way of suppressing
the
radical potential of an active citizenry. Historically, home ownership and all of the debtorship that it entails was promoted in the 1920s and the 1930s as a way of staving off socialism. More recently, student debt has served a similar purpose. Ever since the radical student movements of the 1960s, we have seen the steady rise of student debt. And that is not a coincidence. It is intentional. Student debt is not simply a way of funding education, although it has become the primary way of funding education. Student debt is also a very effective device for suppressing radicalism. An indebted student body is not a free student body. And in a consumer society like ours, the fear of damaging our credit scores is instilled from a very early age. From the very first moment you take out a student loan, or the first credit card that is handed over to you when you become a freshman. Now this is a very powerful fear. And it has a powerful impact on how we think about power. Truly, you can believe there is no alternative if you are faced with crushing debts. Stretching for decades into the future. So student debt is itself a form of foreclosure. It not only distorts educational priorities and severely limits life options, it also radically constrains our political imagination. And I would argue is intended to do so. So it is high time we recognize that student debt is an instrument of power. And an incredibly effective one. If we consider how dependent education now is upon it. Now, this affects faculty as well as students. My salary as a faculty member is debt financed. As are all salaries. They depend on my students going into debt. In order to pay the bills of universities like this. Though we are not accustomed to think of it that way. So does that arrangement constrain our political imagination as faculty?
Constrain our political imagination as faculty.
Of course it does.
Of course it does.
Does it inhibit
Does it inhibit
our efforts to change the system?
our efforts to change the system?
Of course it does.
Of course it does.
It is just not one more reason
It is just not one more reason
to rock the boat.
to rock the boat.
What we are really talking about here
What we are really talking about here
is how the boat is built in the first place.
is how the boat is built in the first place.
The boat of higher education
The boat of higher education
is built out of the wages of the future.
is built out of the wages of the future.
Literally.
Literally.
Its entire funding structure
Its entire funding structure
depends on the future,
depends on the future,
unfulfilled labor of our students.
unfulfilled labor of our students.
The students it is supposed to serve.
The students it is supposed to serve.
This is